Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV WORLD. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two important stories. The first is with reference to a decision that came in late last night with regards to the increase in petrol prices that of course affected the population in Pakistan greatly. Rupees 24 has been increased in the petrol prices, and this of course is the third time it has been done in 20 days by the government. Of course, this is due with regards to the international prices, but again the economic challenges continue to increase for Pakistan and its people as well. Talks with the IMF are still undergoing, and there needs to be a lot that still needs to be worked out with the IMF before we can actually get the bailout package. Demands not only are limited to the increase in fuel prices and the removal of subsidies, but also with regards to the personal income tax and other measurements taken by the government, and also with regards to the budget. So we're going to be taking a look at the overall economic situation of the country, the increase in petrol prices and how it's going to impact the costs in Pakistan, and then of course the talks with the IMF as they're underway and what seems to be the progress on that matter and whether or not Pakistan is looking for other options as well. In our second segment of the show today, we will be taking a look at the situation in India. In our show yesterday, we were talking about the recruitment program that has been recently launched in India with regards to recruitment of its armed forces, which is called Agnipath, where young officers and of the lower ranks are going to be taken in for a period of maximum 4 years. This has been met with a lot of protests that have been broken out in different parts of India, along with areas which have a high recruitment rate in the Indian Armed Forces as well, where the people in India, especially the youth, are complaining about what needs to be done after the end of the 4 years and how they're going to be brought back to society and what are they going to be doing then. So we're going to take a look at this particular scheme and the kind of impact that it has had on the society so far and what the protesters seem to be talking about. So these are two segments of our show today. As usual, in the studios we have with us Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal. And for our first segment in the show today, I have been joined online by Dr. Niaz Murtaza, who is a senior analyst. And as we proceed in the show, Dr. Khaqan Najib, who's a former advisor, Minister of Finance, will also be joining us. I'll start with you, Dr. Niaz. When we look at the economic situation of the country, of course, a matter of major concern for the people is the increase in petrol prices. And it's not just petrol, of course, fuel costs affect other costs as well. And because of that, the increase in costs is exponential, and there's so many that continue to be affected by it. The budget that was earlier put forward as well seem to be offering little respite to the people, and still we have seen that the IMF continues to demand more measures by the government, perhaps more cuts as well, before we can actually get a take on the bailout package. When we look at this situation and of course the economic challenges that are ahead for the government, how do you see this particular decision, and then of course the kind of measures that need to be taken with the IMF? We still haven't heard from them.
And Dr. Saab, is it me or suddenly IMF has become too inflexible?
Well, I think it's a lot of different things. I think we need to understand the context in which all this is happening. It's the fact that, you know, the 2019 program that we started with IMF had fits and start. It started a year after PTI took over, and then, you know, it got suspended because of COVID. Then the other factor is that, you know, a lot of, you know, the agreements that were made by the PTI government were not fulfilled from 2019 till 2022. Then the second factor is, you know, the global economic turmoil that we see because of the Ukraine situation. The oil prices have, you know, gone up so much. Just about 6 months ago, you know, they were less than $75 per barrel, and now they are much above $100 per barrel. So, you know, the oil prices have gone up, and, you know, there is a very strict requirement from IMF that, you know, we cut down on the subsidies because, you know, we were giving hundreds and billions of rupees in blanket subsidies, much of which were going to the rich people who consume most of the fuel. So they are very strict about that, and so the government is forced to, you know, pass it on. But obviously it will have a, you know, disastrous impact on the poor people, both directly in their fuel consumption, but also indirectly because the cost of everything will go down. So there's nothing the government can do in terms of not increasing the oil prices, and I think that should be done. But what could the government do better is to, you know, tax the untaxed sections of the economy and individuals like real estate, agriculture, high consumption, this, that, stop tax evasion and use that saving to pass on much more subsidies to the poor, because it's announced about 2,000 rupees per month for about one-third of the families. That's a good start, but still, I think it should be based on more calculations on what the true impact on a poor family is 2,000.
Right. Dr. Zab, you're concentrating on what we can do, and I think that the government has shown its commitment to do more. But my question was regarding IMF. It is supposed to be International Monetary Fund, not International Monetary Police. So certainly it seems that you're talking to police, which has zero understanding or relaxation for you to offer.
Well, that's true. That's been a long-standing criticism of IMF, the bitter pill that it forces countries to take. And especially now, today, the situation is not just like 2019, where there was no global turmoil. What we had was, a locally created situation. So yeah, you could be more tough in that kind of an environment. But today, when, there's such a global turmoil, oil prices have gone up, there's a fear of a global recession, I think there should be more understanding. And that is definitely,
right, Dr. Niaz, there's also the issue, of course, when we look at the situation, is that whenever the finance minister speaks, he says that there are demands that are still coming in from the IMF, and some will be fulfilled, but there are many others which perhaps are not acceptable. When we're talking about the IMF bailout package, earlier on with the budget coming in as well, of course, there was this impression this is something that has been shared with the IMF line by line, and this is something that's come out with their consent and approval, perhaps. But when we talk about their concerns that still remain, there seems to be many with regards to the budget as well, the personal income tax, because fuel subsidies is one thing, and maybe on that angle the government has given in. But with regards to the rest of the measures, what really can Pakistan actually give up at this moment, and what demands are totally unacceptable?
Especially taxing the middle class.
Well, I think the government has given up on the subsidies after yesterday's hike. I think we are now at par with global prices. There's no more subsidy, though that's gone. The other issue on which the government has signaled its flexibility is on personal income tax slab. In the first budget announced, there was some relief for the middle classes that Farrukh is talking about, and I think that's going to go. And I think the third issue is, the IMF is not certain about, some of the figures given, for example, for the budget deficit, for the primary deficit. So I think two of the major sticking points have now been resolved, and I think now it's more about, the overall framework about, the primary deficit and the overall deficit, and, telling them that, the 7 trillion that the government is planning to, collect through FBR is all based on solid figures. So I think it might still take a week or 10 days, but ultimately I think within this month we should see a deal. Just remember that in 2019, it took PTI government 11 months to stitch a deal with the IMF, and so this is still the second month. So obviously, the situation is much more dicey.
Do we have time?
Sorry?
Do we have time for that?
Because last time the situation was not as dire when it came to possibility of default.
Yeah, because the situation today is much more dicey. The PTI left a much bigger economic crisis now than the PMLN did in 2018. Stark figures in terms of current account deficit, fiscal deficit, inflation, interest rate, your reserves, and so on. It's a much more serious economic crisis. So we have to be quicker, and fortunately, the government is taking the steps, and I do foresee, light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully within this month, before we have to start the new budget, I hope that, the deal will be there, because the rupee is really bleeding, and once that stops bleeding, then, the devaluation that's happened, some of it might get reversed, and that will give some
Dr. Niaz, if we look at two more factors, one of them is, of course, that Pakistan is still fighting war on terror, and a country that is fighting war on terror, it should be, IMF should be quite considerate towards it, number one. Number two, of course, we know that we had a very dry patch in terms of bilateral relations with the US before. Now, as we are, of course, shaping it up well and trying to have good relations, and of course, their ambassador is in Pakistan as well. So things are getting better between Pakistan and US. A country like US that is very influential when it comes to all of these, IMF and United Nations and everything. Don't you think that we should be helped by US in terms of getting a deal?
And Dr. Niaz, before you respond, let me also welcome in the show Dr. Hakan Najib, who's a former advisor, Ministry of Finance. Thank you very much for joining us in the debate, sir. Yes, Dr. Niaz.
Yeah, I mean, it's true the US can help, but then we should also remember how bad the ties between USA and Pakistan became over the last 6 months, and now the new government is in the process of, mending them and, repairing the damage, but, there's still a trust deficit. So I think it's going to take a while. There is also the FATF issue where the US can help us. So you do see some softening in the US attitudes also. And hopefully in the remaining 2 weeks of the month, some of that might, come through. So that's why I'm hopeful that, we'll see a deal by the end of this month.
All right. Dr. Hakan, of course, we're talking about the economic challenges that confront the country and specifically our talks with the IMF. Dr. Niaz is hopeful we will be seeing a deal at the end of the month, but we still haven't really heard from them in a while, and there are still discussions that are continuing. Fuel prices have increased, but there are, of course, other demands from the IMF as well. Are you also hopeful of the fact that before the 1st of July, we'll have a deal?
And while meeting these demands, what becomes of the common man? Because there seems to be inflation, which seems to be going out of control.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's always a pleasure to be on PTV World. Let me put something to you. One, I'm going to approach this a little differently. The prices of fuel in Pakistan, the prices of energy in Pakistan, the prices of electricity in Pakistan, the prices of gas in Pakistan are determined by the regulators of Pakistan, and they are done so when the discos take their claim to them, when the SUI companies take their claim to them. So one thing we must think is that the price of 792, for example, that the government is being kind of asked to now use from 1st of July, an enhanced price on the electricity, is one which NEPRA has determined. Now, once these prices are determined, then the negotiations with the fund begin. And the negotiations with the fund are how much of that price can then be passed on to the consumers and how much of the subsidy can be given to the vulnerable or to the urban middle class in these two sectors. So one, we must be clear that these price determinations are local. The fund does not by any stretch of imagination have any price determinations of any countries. They rely on the local authorities to provide so. But they also do ask that if you have a fiscal leakage, like the one we are having, what does that mean? We are running a fiscal deficit of 7 to 8%. We have been doing that over the last 3 years. For a country like Pakistan, your debt goes up because you have to then borrow. So what they are trying to say is, please do not give this kind of fiscal subsidy, curtail your subsidy. When the petrol subsidies started in March, one was still okay. They were 30 billion in nature. By June, they had risen to 120 billion a month. Right. This was certainly uncomfortable, and so the fund had to come down hard in the negotiations. And you saw that now we have leveled the cost of service and there is no subsidy whatsoever in terms of petrol, diesel, kerosene, and the other oil products. But what we have done, and now coming back to what you were asking, is there any hope for the consumer? That we have put in a subsidy which is targeted to, about 140 million households in the country. What does that mean? We are giving them 2,000 rupees in June, and we are going to continue as a nation giving them that for the next 12 months. It's
right, Dr. Najib, I'm glad that you're talking about these measures, and they are very useful, especially for the most vulnerable. But at this moment, the debate somehow keeps on hovering between the very rich and very poor. The economy of a country is driven by the working class. And at this moment, it seems that while you don't have any targeted subsidies for the common man, especially the working man, they seem to be the most exposed to these inflationary pressures. And simultaneously, you are also perhaps going to increase the personal income tax as well. That will create more problem. And this seems to be slow cancellation of the future, that the working class during the PTI's time as well, we saw that millions actually moved to the poor, below the basic line of subsistence. It seems that that trend is to continue. Is there no other method? Because IMF is important, but convincing IMF is also important, that the entire world is going to dogs right now, and there should be some concessions for the common man.
Because right now what's being said, of course, is that this is what the situation is and there's nothing more that the government can do. And that may be true, but of course, this is something that the common man has to deal with now. So are you going to be paying that cost?
And by the way, agreeing with this spirit, I'm a common man. I mean, I'm sure that there was some kind of ineptitude in the past as well, but I'm not responsible for that. Why am I being penalized for that, sir?
So, very pertinent point. So the people that you're actually talking about, we can help the vulnerable because we have a data set through the income support programs, call them BISP, call them SRs, whatever you so may like. It's a database which every government has carried, so we are getting to them. What we are not trying to, what we are unable to get to are the urban middle class. The people who are earning, and you can define middle class differently, but let's say I define them people who are earning up to about 150 to 2,100 thousand a month. So that's the people I'm most interested in because they are hardest hit. As I climb up the ladder, if I'm in the 400,000 bracket, I think I can still survive. But these people are hit hard, and these are reliant on fixed salaries, and their cost of living is also fixed. So how do we get to them? And this is my advice. And so there is a lot more that can be done. And what can be done here is, I think here we should drop the tax rate of the people up to 200,000 categorically and give them a tax break. And
but the fund doesn't allow that. At this moment, that seems to be the sticking point, is it not?
That is the sticking point, but here I keep saying that the fund has to be convinced by a set of data that you present. So it is now your capacity, your capability to convince the fund that do the right thing based on sound economics, but also based on the sound ground realities of the country, right?
Yes. So, Dr. Niaz, if we look at the, obviously the rates of dollar, the hike of the rates of dollars, of course we know that, Pakistan is a country that has expats all over the world, and they are intact with Pakistan, and we get billions of dollars worth of remittances from throughout the world. Don't you think that it would be, knowing the facts that Pakistan's currency has gone very down, it would sort of attract the FDIs, especially for real estate, and remittances can increase as well, and it can be considered as a positive for the future?
Well, remittances have been the saving grace over the last 3 or 4 years to fill at least half of the current account deficit that we would otherwise have had. Our remittances are often more than what we export. For countries like India and Bangladesh, it's the reverse. Exports is their main dollar earner. For Pakistan, it's the reverse. So I think a lot of it has been coming through, and let's hope that it continues that way. Otherwise, the gap will become bigger and bigger. But then, we have to somehow get our exports going. These are some good steps that the government has taken in terms of, ending the subsidies. And, it's quite brave given that, this government just has a 15-month time horizon at most and a 2-seat majority in the assembly. Given all that, it's very brave to take these very unpopular decisions which other governments have failed to do in the past. But then it should not stop here. It should go through and do other reforms that have been pending for decades, like, the power sector reforms, the state enterprise reforms, the taxation
Right.
reforms,
Right,
getting
and Dr. Niaz, those are of course important. We've talked about reforms and structural change before, but we have been talking about them for maybe way too long. And we've been hearing this again and again on repeat, but we are so dependent on perhaps political stability that we have rarely found in Pakistan that this is something that of course is getting affected. And then you have your economic decisions and your economic measures also getting affected by this. So how are we going to be able to achieve these reforms? Even if we understand their need, are we actually working towards getting them? Because that's a long way as well.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you just do these, painful fuel hike rises, that will, introduce all the pain for everybody. And then if they are not followed by more meaningful reforms, there'll be no structural change in the economy. And, after 3 or 4 years, will be another similar crisis. So that's why I'm saying, even though, it's just got 15 months, I think it should start the process of reform now. And that's how it's going to, win back people. If it can show that it's the first, government in Pakistan's history in a long time, which is introducing long-term reforms, that's the way to get your voters back. Otherwise,
but Dr. Niaz Mirza, just to qualify what Sana said, and especially this fatigue regarding reforms or skepticism for that matter, I just wanted to qualify that the reason why there are so many vulnerable people will be paying extra buck for fuel, for electricity, is that some parts of the economy don't pay their bills. And that's why the monies actually keep on, or the fines keep on increasing for other people. At that time, when the government is subsidizing inefficient SOEs, why is it that the common man should be penalized for that? If reform is not going to take place, then tomorrow, day after tomorrow, further hikes will take place and we will be penalized. Is it not important to actually ask the government to offload PIA, railways, others?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The other reforms that I'm talking about are not going to penalize the poor people so much. They're about, going after, those subsidies, which the rich benefit from, and, the state bureaucrats and so on. And in some ways, those are, harder reforms to do because, those big elite people have much more political clout than the poor people. So that's what I'm saying. I'm suggesting a political strategy to the government. Go for those two. Those will put little burden on the poor people, but it will show the, will of the government to go after the big cats.
All right.
Dr. Hakan, if we look at the world right now, of course, majority of the countries, especially the underdeveloped countries like Pakistan and the developing world, they are being hit by two very important things going on in the world. First of all, of course, Ukraine-Russia war right now, that is affecting economies directly. And the secondly, all of these, crude oil crisis or oil crisis, it has a lot to do with, of course, Iran, that has, one of the biggest reserves, oil reserves with it. IAEA deal is not getting well with them. Of course, the talks, they keep on failing. Do you think that in coming days, if the talks go well, plus Russia and Ukraine crisis gets over, the things that are wrong with our economy can settle up?
So the entire world will have to settle up first, yeah? You fix the entire world first. Sir, go ahead.
So first, let me quickly comment on the earlier discussion and then come to this. Look, right now, you have to realize that the patient is in kind of a very difficult position. So you have to do what is required.
Right.
Unfortunately, we are not able to hear Mr. Hakan or perhaps Dr. Niaz as well. So we'll try and reconnect with them once again. Yes, Farrukh, you want to add
very
something?
quickly, Dr. Hakan earlier, because our other friend was also saying this. It is important to remember that the only reason the poor has to pay so much GST is because the rich don't pay their taxes. That's why you end up with the indirect methods, getting fees or getting taxes through electricity as well. Till the time those things are not fixed, and I tell you, Sana, that there are such a big entitled class in this country who don't want to pay anything, and yet they get the lion's share of benefits, right?
Right.
I'm talking about businessmen, I'm talking about even traders, because they are unionized. At that time, common man will be further squeezed, and that means that the middle class, that is the engine of the economy, will be squeezed further, and your economy is going to go in a slow motion. It is going to slow down. And earlier, Dr. Niaz Mirza was also saying that Pakistan should be focusing on the exports. The biggest problem is Pakistan does not produce all the raw material needed for exports. So you'll have to, if you want to increase your exports, your imports will also increase. And that is one thing that we don't want to do, because when we do it, dollar leaks out, dollar actually starts bleeding from the country. So what is the solution? That means just stifle the economy and be done with it.
Farrukh, but I want to understand, when we talk about all of these issues, of course, this is something that will be quite apparent and obvious to the IMF as well, and they would understand the impact of the policies that are going to be there on the people. And if we can talk about different avenues, for example, getting more money out of the rich or big businesses, then why isn't that on the table as well?
Right, Sana, first of all, it is important to understand our own failings. Our own FPR, our own machinery, government machinery has not been able to actually act against tax avoiders or people who actually commit tax fraud. So that is one thing that we have to do, and we have to actually expand the tax net. Till that time, of course, those who are already paying, they will be further squeezed, and that continues to happen. If you are a salaried person, you will be further squeezed. If you are somebody who registered voluntarily, there will be pressure on you. This has been happening in the past, although government keeps on shielding. But I'm seldom in prophetic mood. Today is one of those occasions. So I'm going to say something about IMF itself. You know, there's this very interesting, funny series called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in which Arthur, the main character, Arthur Dent, his house is demolished because of some,
Was
you
he
know,
sorry? Was he Indian Muslim?
His not quite, but let us first focus on what I'm trying to say. You know, his house is, you know, demolished because of some kind of cock-up, some kind of mismanagement of bureaucracy. And later on we learned that the entire earth is also demolished by the alien bureaucracy because of similar kind of cock-up. And he is the only one who survives. So I tell you one thing, what IMF has done, or the way it has dealt with Sri Lanka, the way it is dealing with us, the way inflexibly it is dealing with other countries, I think that its own stock might erode very quickly, and if that erodes, it will be shame, because in the end we need IMF. So IMF will have to show some sensibilities as well. At this moment, they don't seem to be in the mood.
Right, Faisal, Dr. Khaqan is back with us, so we'll continue the discussion after he completes his thought. Yes, Dr. Khaqan, earlier you were adding something. Can you hear us?
No.
Fortunately, we've lost him again.
Farrukh,
yes.
I wanted to make a comment. Farrukh, you mentioned about Sri Lanka, you mentioned about Pakistan, and we remember that you have been highlighting this fact since a long time, that who is at the key position in IMF right now, why the countries that are encircled around India, it is only happening to them.
Right, that is an interesting question, but Afghanistan is not one of those, right? Afghanistan also fell through the cracks, but it is happening more and more, and I think it has something to do with COVID as well. And then India might have actually, and you're right at least regarding the impulse, India is one of the contributors now to IMF, and they have their chief economist, who is now vice president, is also an Indian passport holder. But that is not all, sir. The fact is that at this moment, I think the teacher itself, you know, China used to call America the teacher, right? Because they were teaching capitalism, they were teaching how to modernize. And then when 2008 happened, the Chinese started saying that the teacher seems to have developed problems of their own. And I think at this moment, everything is up in the air.
Yeah.
Inflation is affecting the Western countries as well. Yesterday, if you know, America's Federal Reserve has increased its interest rate, and that actually gives the fears of not inflation, but global recession.
Yeah.
So in that situation, at this moment, I think IMF should be more relaxed, and it should at least be listening to the other side instead of just penalizing them and demanding for an arm and a leg.
Right. We'll just go back to Dr. Hakan one last time before we move on to our next segment. Can you hear us? Dr. Hakan, are you with us?
Yes, I am, and I can hear you very well.
All right, great. We can hear you as well. Before we had this problem, you were adding something and you were responding to Faisal's question. He's eager to learn more.
Sure. So what I'm trying to say is that right now Pakistan is in a survival mode, and that survival mode must be ensured by getting him back into the IMF program, completing the 7th review, which unfortunately has been held for the last 4 months. And once we are done with that, then we must start thinking of rebuilding the key sectors of the economy. And that is where we start thinking about what we have been talking about, the structural reforms, the privatization. But the next 3 to 6 months are not looking to have policy maneuverability to do much. This policy maneuverability will come once we have our macro numbers stable, once our reserves, which have fallen under around $9 billion, start building up. And this cannot be accomplished without going to the fund. So that's first. But 2 areas that I think in 1 year the government should concentrate on, rather than spreading thin. One is that agriculture productivity should be a must, and I see good measures in the budget. So one is happy to see that. The area that one is uncomfortable with is the meager amount of privatization monies that have been kept, which is only about 96 billion in the budget. And I think one can think about doing more on the privatization side. It will not only get us money, but improve the service delivery for the people of Pakistan, whether it's PIA, whether it's the discos, whether it's the SUI companies. So that's how we should think.
Dr. Saab, I'm glad that you're talking about all these measures which might actually result in something fruitful. Let me ask you, because you have the luxury of actually advising the government in the past as well. This whole idea, usually when you go to IMF calls it homegrown package, and then you actually go for the proposals, and those proposals are accepted, or at least it is thought it works that way. Tell me, why is it that passing on prices or inflation to the common man somehow becomes the most important thing, rather than offloading all these sick units that the government of Pakistan has? And I say this because it seems that in the end it is the common man who is indirectly taxed, who is indirectly punished through other bills and other measures, rather than actually squeezing those people who are not being productive. And then PIA, railways, steel mills, umpteen other SOEs, which are white elephants, which are just eating up all the resources. Why is it that neither the fund actually asks you to actually offload them, nor do we do anything substantial to get rid of them?
So the most pertinent question of today's session is what you've just put forward, I must say. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The fund has a time horizon of 2 to 3 years, so they don't think that we can do a whole lot in them, so they try to rely on the pricing changes. Number 2, countries go to the fund when they are bleeding, and the easiest way to stop the bleeding is to say that charge more so that you can get in more revenue and you can pass through. And number 3, the fund also feels that this is not their forte to do structural changes. Their forte is to take the patient out of the ICU, and then the general ward doctors, they do the surgery, and then the general ward doctors must take over. And here is what I say. For example, I'll give you an example of the PMLN government They were in the fund program, right? I was steering it for them once they came in 2013 to 2016, but did not stop them to put in 2 LNG terminals, did not stop us to put in, a number of 1,000 megawatts of power in the country. So we moved. Did the fund stop us? No. So then comes in what you...
But hang on, sir, hang on. In 2014, when PTI was on the streets in Islamabad, at that time, the fund actually showed you a lot of flexibility, and you managed to actually renegotiate some of the terms. It doesn't seem to be the case right now. You can say that right now we might be in ICU, but honestly, when I look back at my own life, I think that this survival mode is a vicious cycle. We end up there every 10 years.
Absolutely. So we end up there because we do the pricing changes, we build our reserves, we borrow a bit, but then those have to be then underpinned by the fact that you now have a banking sector doing very well because you privatized it, but you didn't do the same with the energy, so you have a bleeding energy sector. You didn't do very well with the railway because you kept it in today's world. Just think about it as a government department. So you are bleeding about 40 billion a year there. PIA, just think about it, is trying to compete with the airlines where decisions are made in minutes, and here the decision are like you're dealing on a file which goes all the way. So it is time that we realize that we can do more than the fund, and that is up to us what we do.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Hakan Najib. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but thank you very much for being part of the debate. In our next segment of the show today, we will be taking a look at Agnipath, the new recruitment process that has been launched by the Indian Armed Forces. And Faisal, this is something that we were earlier discussing in our show yesterday as well. And we talked about the different aspects and consequences of this particular process as well. And now we're seeing that in the form of protesters that have been protesting in different parts of India with regards to what is going to happen at the end of 4 years. What do you have to say about that?
And before you start answering, I have a bone to pick with you, Faisal. Yesterday, while we were discussing the whole thing and you were explaining it, you did not mention how influenced this title of the program is from the Indian film industry. Exactly. There's a movie called Agnipath.
Not one, and I was going through two. It was one of them was in the 90s, and then I think the other movie, the new one was in 2010.
Yeah, the first one had Amitabh Bachchan. I know it.
Exactly, and
I know the second one.
And let me tell you. I think we very well know that the kind of surgical strikes and all of these the terms which were coined against Pakistan previously. All of them, they were the Bollywood stuff as well.
Either they were Bollywood, or then they kept on listening what is going on in Israel and other countries, and then they copied it.
They copied it, and even they even hired the sort of experts from Hollywood to make that kind of movie which can show that it was real. Whereas on ground there was nothing, and we know that. And Agnipath, once again, since yesterday. We talked about it. Of course, while I was talking about it, I was concerned. I was worried about India. I was saying that I'm amazed that nobody is coming out for protests, and today they have toshed one of the trains as well. They are pelting stones over police everywhere. They are going to BJP offices in districts, in tehsils, everywhere, and they are pelting stones over them. The only reason is I think people on ground, they have started realizing that under the guise of training the soldiers, there is something very fishy which is going on behalf of BJP with the help of RSS. They want to train the goons, they want to train the terrorists, they want to institutionalize the terror training with the help of Indian Army. They want to, after 2026, but every year.
Faisal, are the protesters actually talking about that?
Sorry?
Because I think they have different concerns. Are the protesters actually talking about that?
Yeah. They were talking about the safety net, that is pensions.
Right.
Pensions.
After 4 years, they will not have any safety net, and they will be moved out of the service.
The only set amount they will be getting, it would be nearly 12 lakh rupees.
Indian rupees.
Indian rupees, 12 lakh Indian rupees. And every year, 35,000 so-called soldiers aka terrorists, they will be getting back into the society, having 12 lakh Indian rupees, and we know what they have the plans for. Of course, they want to send in the society, and the things which are going on against the minorities right now, of course they will be at full swing once every year 35,000 soldiers, aka terrorists, go back to society.
But Faisal, yesterday we were also talking about this, and we spoke to our guests with reference to this being something that is not limited to India. Such schemes or such recruitment processes have been deployed in other parts of the world as well. So the concerns that are being raised, how valid are they in terms of the Indian community and society, and the impact that they're having? Yes, I'm coming to you, Farrukh.
Yeah.
This one's for you. Yes, Farrukh.
Is it for Farrukh?
It's for
No,
Farrukh.
no, you go ahead. You finish that thought, and then I'm going to actually jump in.
Respond to that as well.
I tell you about Israel. If we talk about Israel, of course they have the short-term service in their military as well. But their economy, of course, is a very different economy to what India's economy is. And Farrukh highlighted a very excellent point yesterday, that the population of India, that's what matters. And if we look at
money also,
money.
Look at the 600 plus billion dollars foreign reserves.
But what I want to understand is there anything fundamentally harmful or damaging in this process to any society?
Actually
bookmark that word, fundamentally, because I'm going to come back to that.
Fundamentally, if we talk about Israel, we know that there are so many incidents in which of course all of these people, once they get back to the society, they kill rather than having an argument with somebody, because they are trained to kill. And this is what is going to happen in India. Rather than having little brawls or little arguments with each other, these people who will be getting trained to kill, they will kill once they get back to the societies.
All right, go ahead, Farrukh.
Right, you used word fundamental. So that reminded me of what you used to say about the fundamentalists, that people who were mental and who started getting funds, and then that stopped. So they are mental, right, more mental. And at this moment, when you look at Indian government, the problem with these fundamentalists, these fascistic governments, is that they are more like a hyper coked up maniac, right? So they cannot sit down, they cannot settle down, and they have to keep on doing things, right? Look at how many controversies they have generated in the past 2 weeks alone. And you'll realize that India is going to be destroyed by these maniacs, right? At this moment, the comparison that Faisal actually highlighted yesterday, the total population of Israel is 9.2 million people, right? And they are surrounded by countries which otherwise are more populated and more powerful, right? If you remove the nuclear ambiguity and the army, the way it is honed, otherwise all Arab countries are around them, right? So it becomes a matter of necessity to train every citizen and to keep them as reserve. It is not the case with India. India is a humongous landmass. Then it has 1.3 billion people. Then its economy is so big. I keep on talking about their foreign currency reserves and their GDP. At that time, the idea to actually wash your hands off of people who are going to sacrifice for you is really shameful. At this moment, when they are thinking about it, I don't know what's Kokamimi's scheme this is, but in the end, it is going to hurt India, because you will create more unemployed or more unemployable people, because they have actually been put through the discipline of army, and because they didn't have service, at the prime of their life, they are going to be flung into the society, and they will be asked to actually provide for themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One last comment, Sana, one last comment.
Quickly,
as we have in obviously extremist Islam, ISIS Khorasan is training the extremists in obviously Nangarhar and Cunard province. Right now, the Indian institutionalized the training, the terror training of course, Indian army would be playing the role of ISIS Khorasan in India
All
for
right.
training the Hindutva terrorists.
All right. Well, the two Agnipats before did great at the box office. Let's see how this one does at the charts. Thank you very much for watching the debate. That's all we have for now.